It was the fall of 1966, and backstage at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, the air smelled like cigarette smoke, sweat, and something harder to name. Fear, maybe. Or ambition. The Apollo was sacred ground. Every black artist in America knew that if you could not survive the Apollo, you could not survive anything. The audience did not just watch performances. They judged them. They booed legends off the stage. They threw things at amateurs. And they worshipped, truly worshipped, those rare performers who could make them forget their troubles for a few hours on a Saturday night. On this particular night, two men were about to cross paths in a way that would alter the course of soul music forever. One of them was James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, a man who did not just perform at the Apollo but owned it in every way that mattered. The other was Otis Redding, a 25-year-old from Georgia who had been making noise in the music world for 4 years but had not yet crossed into the kind of legendary status that James Brown occupied like a throne. James Brown did not just walk into rooms. He commanded them. At 5'6", he was smaller than most men, but his presence filled every corner of every space he entered. His live album, recorded at this very theater in 1962, had stayed on the charts for 66 weeks and turned him from a regional rhythm and blues star into a national phenomenon. When James Brown walked through the backstage doors of the Apollo, security guards straightened their backs. Stage crew nodded with respect. Even other performers stepped aside. Because James Brown was not just a singer. He was a force of nature wrapped in a cape and polished shoes. A man who could drop to his knees, slide across a stage, spin 3 times, hit a split, and land exactly on the beat without breaking a sweat. But there was a problem growing quietly in James Brown's kingdom, like a crack spreading through a wall. The problem had a name. Otis Redding. Otis had not come out of nowhere, though it might have looked that way to people who did not know the South. He had come out of Dawson, Georgia, a tiny speck of a town where his family had worked as sharecroppers on a plantation. When Otis was 3 years old, his family packed what little they had and moved to Macon, settling into Tyndall Heights, a public housing project where the walls were thin, the winters were cold, and the future was something other people had. Otis's father preached at the Vineville Baptist Church on Sundays and worked as a laborer during the week, until tuberculosis ate through his lungs and left him bedridden, gasping for air in a hospital room while his wife worked double shifts to keep 6 children fed. Otis was 15 when he dropped out of Ballard Hudson High School, not because he was lazy, not because he did not care about education, but because his family was starving and someone had to bring money home. He dug wells. He pumped gas. He worked any job that would pay him enough to put food on the table. But every Sunday he sang. He sang in church with a voice that made the old women in the front pew close their eyes and grab each other's hands. He sang at a local talent show and won 15 weeks in a row until they finally told him to stop competing because nobody else had a chance. 15 weeks. $5 each time. $75 total. That felt like a fortune to a boy who had been eating rice and beans for dinner 6 nights a week. But here is what you need to understand about Otis Redding. He did not sing like anyone else. He did not have Sam Cooke's silky elegance or Jackie Wilson's theatrical precision. Otis sang like a man running out of time, like every note might be his last. His voice cracked. It screamed. It whispered. It begged. And when Otis opened his mouth, something happened in the room that you could not explain. People stopped talking. People stopped breathing. The sound coming from this young man was so raw, so honest, so desperately alive that it felt like witnessing something holy. By 1966, Otis Redding had become the biggest star at Stax Records in Memphis. He had hits. He had a band. He had the kind of live show that left audiences drenched in sweat and screaming for more. The music press had started calling him the King of Soul. The King of Soul. And that title, those 3 words, landed on James Brown's desk like a declaration of war. Because James Brown was the King of Soul, he had earned it with blood and sweat and 2 decades of grinding through every juke joint and church hall in the American South. He had built soul music from the ground up, and now some kid from Macon who had been famous for 4 years was trying to steal his crown. No, James Brown was not going to let that happen. Now, here is where we need to understand something about James Brown. He grew up harder than almost anyone in American music. Born in a one-room shack in Barnwell, South Carolina in 1933, abandoned by his mother at age 4, raised by his aunt in a house that doubled as a brothel in Augusta, Georgia, he shined shoes for pennies. He danced for tips on the sidewalk. At 16, he was arrested for breaking into cars and sentenced to 8 to 16 years in prison. A teenage boy in the segregated South, he served 3 years and walked out with one thought burning in his mind. I will never be powerless again. That need for control, that hunger to dominate every room and every stage, was not arrogance. It was survival. He fined his musicians for missing notes, for dirty shoes, for being late. Perfection was not a goal. It was the only thing standing between him and the poverty he had crawled out of. And now, Otis Redding, this kid who had been famous for all of 4 years, was being called the King of Soul by the same press that had built James Brown into a legend. The confrontation happened backstage at the Apollo on a Saturday night in the fall of 1966. Both men were scheduled to perform that week as part of a multi-artist showcase. The lineup was stacked: Sam and Dave, the Marvelettes, Wilson Pickett, but everyone knew the real show was going to be the unspoken battle between James Brown and Otis Redding. Otis arrived early that afternoon with his band. He was 25 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could light up a room. Otis was warm. He was generous. He bought meals for his band. He remembered people's names. But beneath that warmth was steel. Otis Redding had not survived poverty and the brutal racism of the American South by being soft. He was kind, but he was not weak. James Brown was already backstage when Otis arrived. He was sitting in his dressing room with the door open, which was unusual. James Brown's dressing room door was always closed. Always. It was a power move. You did not come to James Brown. James Brown decided when and if he wanted to see you. But tonight, the door was open, and James Brown was sitting in a chair facing the hallway, wearing a perfectly pressed suit, his hair immaculate, his shoes gleaming like mirrors. He was waiting. Otis walked past the dressing room, nodded politely, and kept moving toward his own room down the hall. He had barely taken 3 steps when he heard it. "Hey, Big O." Otis stopped. He turned around slowly. James Brown was standing in the doorway now, arms crossed, leaning against the frame with a smile that had no warmth in it. "Come in here for a minute," James said. "Let me talk to you." Otis hesitated for just a second. His road manager put a hand on his arm, a silent warning. But Otis shook his head slightly and walked back toward the dressing room. He stepped inside. James closed the door behind him. What happened next has been pieced together from interviews with musicians who were backstage that night, from road crew members, and from Otis himself, who told the story to Steve Cropper during a late-night recording session in Memphis weeks later. James Brown sat back down in his chair and looked up at Otis. He did not offer him a seat. Another power move. James Brown's entire life was a series of carefully calculated power moves. "I hear they're calling you the King of Soul," James said. Otis did not flinch. "I hear that too," he said calmly. "You think that's accurate?" "I think that's what the people are saying." James leaned forward. "The people say a lot of things. The people said Sam Cooke was the greatest. Where's Sam Cooke now? The people said Little Richard was the future of rock and roll. Where's Little Richard now? The people are fickle. They build you up so they can tear you down. That's what the people do." Otis stood there, hands at his sides, listening. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He just listened. Because Otis Redding understood something that most young artists did not. He understood that James Brown was not really talking about titles or crowns. He was talking about fear. "You sing pretty, Otis," James continued, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Almost. I'll give you that. You've got a nice voice. The ladies like it. The critics like it. But pretty doesn't make you the King of Soul. Pretty doesn't fill a stadium. Pretty doesn't change the world. You want to know what changes the world?" James stood up and stepped closer to Otis. Close enough that Otis could smell his cologne. "Work," James said. "Discipline. Sacrifice. I've been doing this since before you picked up a microphone. I've bled for this music. I've starved for this music. I've been locked in a cage for 3 years and came out swinging harder than before. So with all due respect, Big O, don't let a couple of magazine articles go to your head. You sing pretty, but pretty doesn't make you the king of anything." The room went silent. Outside, you could hear the muffled sound of the band warming up on stage, the hum of the crowd filtering through the walls. Otis stood perfectly still for what felt like a long time. And then he did something that shocked James Brown. He smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a submissive smile. A real, genuine, warm smile. Like James had just told him the most fascinating thing he had ever heard. "Mr. Brown," Otis said quietly, "I respect everything you've built. I respect the roads you paved. Every soul singer in America walks on a path that you helped create. And I mean that." James blinked. He had not expected this response. "But I didn't come here to take your crown," Otis continued. "I came here to sing. That's all I know how to do. I can't dance like you. I can't move like you. I can't put on the kind of show you put on. That's your gift. But when I open my mouth and close my eyes, something comes out that I can't control, and neither can anyone else. And tonight, when I step on that stage, I'm going to sing like my life depends on it. Not because I'm trying to beat James Brown, but because there are people in that audience who need to hear what I have to say. People who are hurting, people who are alone, people who need someone to sing for them like their pain matters. That's what I do. And I'm not going to apologize for it." Otis turned and walked out of the dressing room. He did not slam the door. He did not look back. He just walked down the hallway toward his own room. And behind him, for the first time anyone could remember, James Brown had nothing to say. That night, the Apollo was packed to the ceiling. Every seat filled. People standing in the aisles. People pressed against the walls. The energy in that building was something you could feel in your teeth, a vibration that started in the floor and climbed up through your bones. Everyone knew something special was going to happen. They just did not know what. James Brown went on first, and he was magnificent. He opened with a scream that split the air like lightning. And from that moment, he owned every molecule of oxygen in the room. He dropped to his knees. He slid across the stage. He spun. He sweated through his shirt and threw off a cape and kept going. His band was locked in tighter than a Swiss watch. James Brown performed for 45 minutes. And when he finished, the audience was on its feet, screaming, crying, completely destroyed. As he walked off stage, dripping with sweat, he allowed himself a small smile. "Beat that," he thought. "Beat that, Big O." Otis Redding watched the entire performance from the wings. He stood in the darkness with his arms folded, not moving, not speaking. His band stood behind him, nervous. They had just witnessed the greatest live performer in America deliver the performance of a lifetime. How do you follow that? His road manager leaned in. "We can change the set list. Open with something big." Otis shook his head. "We're not changing anything." "But Otis, after what James just did, we're not changing anything," Otis repeated. And his voice was so quiet and so certain that his road manager stopped talking immediately. The announcer stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, from Macon, Georgia, by way of Memphis, Tennessee, the king of soul himself, Otis Redding." The crowd cheered, but you could hear it. They were tired. James Brown had wrung them out like a dish rack. They had given everything they had to James, and now they were supposed to summon the energy for another performer. The applause was polite, warm even, but it was not electric. Not yet. Otis walked onto the stage alone. No band behind him. Just Otis, a microphone, and 2,000 pairs of eyes staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion. He did not say a word. He did not introduce himself. He did not smile or wave or do any of the things performers do to win an audience over. He just stood there, hanging in the center of that legendary stage, and closed his eyes. The silence stretched. 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. People started shifting in their seats. Was something wrong? Had he forgotten where he was? Whispers started to ripple through the crowd. And then Otis opened his mouth and sang. No music, no band, no drums, no horns, no bass. Just his voice, naked and enormous, filling every corner of that theater like water flooding a room. For a moment, it sounded like it might break. For a moment, it sounded like the weight of what he was carrying might be too much. But it did not break. It bent. It bent the way metal bends in a forge, getting hotter and stronger the more pressure you apply. By the time the band kicked in 45 seconds later, the audience was already gone. Gone from that theater. Gone from Harlem. Gone from 1966 entirely. Otis Redding had taken them somewhere else. That place where your chest hurts and your eyes burn and you realize that the person on stage is not performing for you. He is bleeding for you. He is giving you something that costs him everything. And he is doing it because he believes his pain can heal yours. Otis sang for 50 minutes. He screamed. He whispered. He dropped to his knees, not because it was choreographed, but because the music literally knocked him down. He grabbed the microphone stand like a man in a hurricane, and the audience held on to each other. And somewhere in the middle of it all, The line between performer and audience disappeared completely. There was no stage. There was no crowd. There was just one enormous beating heart. 2,000 people breathing together, crying together, healing together. When it was over, Otis stood at the center of the stage, drenched in sweat, his shirt torn, his voice raw, his eyes closed. The audience did not applaud immediately. They could not. They sat in their seats in perfect silence for 3 full seconds, which in the life of a concert is an eternity. And then the Apollo Theater exploded. People were on their feet, screaming, crying, grabbing strangers and hugging them, pounding the arms of their chairs, stamping their feet on the floor until the whole building shook. The ovation lasted over 4 minutes. For minutes of pure, unfiltered, overwhelming love. Backstage, James Brown stood in the hallway. He had watched the entire performance on a small monitor in his dressing room. His face was unreadable. His band members stood around him, not knowing what to say. Then James Brown did something nobody expected. He straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and walked down the hallway toward Otis Redding's dressing room. He knocked once. The door opened. Otis was sitting on a folding chair, a towel draped over his shoulders, a bottle of water in his hand. He looked up at James Brown and waited. "That was something," James said quietly. Otis nodded. "Thank you." James stood in the doorway for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes intense. Then he said something that years later Steve Cropper would describe as one of the most honest things he had ever heard one artist say to another. "I've been performing for 20 years, James said. I know every trick, every step, every way to make an audience lose their minds. I can control a crowd the way a conductor controls an orchestra. But what you did out there tonight, that wasn't control. That was surrender. You surrendered to the music, and the music took over, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if I can learn. But I know what I saw. And what I saw was real." Otis looked up at James Brown. 2 men from Georgia. 2 men who had clawed their way out of poverty through sheer talent and will. 2 men who loved the same music and carried the same weight of being black artists in an industry that was happy to exploit them while pretending to celebrate them. "There's room for both of us," Otis said simply. James looked at him for a long time. Then he extended his hand. Otis took it. "There's room for both of us," James repeated. And for the first time that night, his smile was genuine. What happened at the Apollo that night did not end the rivalry between James Brown and Otis Redding. If anything, it intensified it. But it changed the nature of the competition. It was no longer about who was better. It was about who could give more. James Brown went back into the studio and recorded some of the most innovative music of his career, pushing deeper into funk, creating rhythms that would eventually become the foundation of hip-hop. And Otis Redding went back to Stax Records in Memphis and began work on what he believed would be the most important album of his life. The next year, in June 1967, Otis Redding stood on a stage at the Monterey International Pop Festival in California. He performed for a crowd of tens of thousands, almost entirely white, who had come to see rock bands and psychedelic acts. Most of them had never heard of Otis Redding. When he walked onto that stage wearing a lime green suit, backed by the legendary Booker T and the MGs, the crowd was polite but uncertain. This was not their music. Otis looked out at that sea of flower children and hippies and said 5 words that became legendary. "This is the love crowd." And then he sang with everything he had, the same way he had sung at the Apollo, the same way he had sung in church as a boy. He sang, "Try a Little Tenderness." And by the time he hit the final note, tens of thousands of white hippies who had never listened to soul music in their lives were on their feet, screaming, absolutely converted and absolutely in love with this man and his voice and his message. But that moment at Monterey, as glorious as it was, carries a shadow. Because what nobody in that crowd knew, what nobody on that stage knew, what Otis himself may not have known, was that he had less than 6 months to live. On December 7th, 1967, Otis Redding sat down in Stax Studios in Memphis with Steve Cropper and recorded a song unlike anything he had ever done. It was quiet, gentle, almost fragile. A song about sitting on a dock, watching the tide roll in, watching ships come and go while the world moved on without you. Otis had been inspired by a week he spent on a houseboat in Sausalito, California, staring at the water, thinking about his life, about his children, about Zelma, his wife, The girl he had met at a teenage party when she was 15 and he was 17, the woman who had believed in him before anyone else. He sat on that houseboat and felt for the first time in years something that was not hunger or ambition or fear. He felt peace. 3 days later, on December 10th, 1967, Otis Redding boarded a small twin-engine plane in Cleveland, Ohio, headed for a concert in Madison, Wisconsin. The weather was terrible. Fog, rain, poor visibility. The plane carried Otis, his road manager, the pilot, and 4 members of his band, the Barcase. The plane went down into Lake Monona, for miles from the airport. Otis Redding was 26 years old. The song he had recorded 3 days earlier was released 2 months later. It climbed the charts like nothing he had ever released before. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming the first posthumous #1 single in the history of the chart. The song was called Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. And the most haunting part of that recording, the part that still makes people close their eyes and hold their breath, is the ending. After the final verse, Otis does not sing. He whistles, a soft, wandering, melancholy little melody that drifts away into silence. Sharecropper later said that the whistling was a placeholder. Otis had planned to come back and record proper lyrics for that section, but he never came back, and so the whistling stayed, a placeholder that became immortal, an unfinished thought from a man who ran out of time. When James Brown heard the news, he canceled his shows for 3 days. James Brown, the hardest-working man in show business, the man who never canceled anything, went dark for 3 days. He sat in his hotel room and listened to Otis Redding records on a portable turntable, one after another, starting with These Arms of Mine, and working through everything Otis had ever recorded. On the 4th day, James Brown walked into a studio and recorded a tribute. He did not release it. He did not play it for anyone. It sat in a tape box for years, heard by almost no one. But people who were in the room that day said it was one of the most emotional performances James Brown ever gave. His voice broke. His hands shook. The Godfather of Soul, the man who controlled everything, could not control himself. Years later, in an interview, James Brown was asked about Otis Redding. The interviewer expected the usual guarded response, the careful diplomatic language that celebrities use when talking about rivals. Instead, James Brown sat quietly for a long moment, and then said something that surprised everyone in the room. "I told Otis he sang pretty," James said. "I told him pretty wasn't enough. And then he went out on that stage and showed me that what he had wasn't pretty. What he had was true, and true is always enough. True is always bigger than everything else. I spent my whole life learning every trick in the book. Otis didn't need tricks. He just needed a microphone and a heartbeat. And that's something you can't teach. You can't practice it. You can't rehearse it. You either have it or you don't. And Otis had it. God help me, he had it." James Brown paused, and for the first time in the interview, his eyes were wet. "The world called us rivals," he said. "Maybe we were. But rivals push each other. Rivals make each other better. Otis Redding made me better. He made me dig deeper. He made me honest. And I'll carry that with me until the day I die." The story of Otis Redding and James Brown is not just about 2 musicians who competed for a title. It is about what happens when raw vulnerability meets disciplined power. 2 men from Georgia, born into poverty, scarred by racism, who channeled their pain into music that changed the world. One did it through control. The other did it through surrender. Together, they created a decade of soul music that humanity will never forget. Otis Redding's voice was silenced at 26, but the echoes never stopped. His records have been played at weddings and funerals, at protests and celebrations, in cars driving through the night, and in living rooms where people sit alone and need to feel understood. His whistling at the end of Dock of the Bay still hangs in the air like a question never answered, a life never finished, a story never supposed to end this way. And somewhere in that unfinished melody, you can hear the truth that James Brown finally admitted. Some voices are not meant to last forever. They are meant to burn so bright and so hot that even after they go out, you can still feel the warmth. You can still hear the echo bouncing off the walls of an empty theater where a young man from Georgia once closed his eyes and showed the world what it sounds like when a human soul catches fire.